Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Aidan and I'm from rural Kentucky, where I live on a self-sustaining farm where we grow fields of soya beans, and the crop grows well in this part of the world, provided it has a good water supply and ample sunshine, of course. I live on this farm with my mother and dad and my two sisters, Lisa and Poppy, who are both younger than I am. This farm has been in our family line for several generations and is a quintessential Queen Anne-style farmhouse, which was initially built in 1831. And like the Painted Ladies, our wooden farmhouse has a very bright, dramatic, deep blue exterior that really works rather well with the panoramic backdrop of exquisite Kentucky country views. This unconventional colour scheme is a distinct Queen Anne trait, which embraced an unfettered artistic expression in the patterns and details that defined the style of the time. Our home has the typical round towers, broad decorative gables and elaborate Queen Anne dormers, windows and chimneys. This historic, old-world, sumptuous, cosy and enchanting home of ours is surrounded by rolling green hills that are affectionately known as the Knobs by the locals who live here. One thing about Kentucky is the land is never flat, which means that the verdant countryside is always undulating and never monotonous or unvaried. To access our property, you drive up a long, windy dirt driveway lined with turf, and you pass a scattering of pretty trees that are sumptuously dotted throughout the valley with bushy heads of abundant green leaves. We possess white wooded poled fencing, barns, a pond and a creek, and the area on the rear of our land stretches out into a vast greenwood oasis, teeming with indigenous wildlife, from bears to white-tailed deer, rabbits, raccoons, foxes, possums and woodchucks. I have a Bigfoot story to share with your listeners, as well as several anomalous aberrated encounters that I know that your channel will embrace very heartily, which I'm eager to share with you all. When I was about 10 years old, my mother and father decided to perform some alterations to our home, but as they highly esteemed the Queen Anne architecture of our house, they were naturally desirous to preserve the historic integrity, but at the very same time embrace some of the interior privileges of an open-plan living space so often sought after in more modern architecture styles. So for a masterful job like this, my mother sought out the help of a highly esteemed and genius architect who was well acquainted and knowledgeable about Queen Anne architecture. My mother wanted to build a large, spacious, indulgent kitchen area, along with a sizable entertainment expanse, and our stylish architect literally fulfilled her greatest desires with some phenomenal, awe-inspiring plans. In a trice, the rowdy, noisy builders arrived, and there was quite a lot of mayhem which ultimately resulted in disturbing banging and knocking sounds, as is often evident in most building projects. It would seem that there was havoc and disarray on our farm as they began creating all the extensions, and so a great deal of chaos ensued, as is always the case with building enterprises of any kind. It would seem that shortly after the extensions were indeed completed in our home, we began to experience some strange anomalies and bizarre, enigmatic events, as car keys would mysteriously go missing, only to be found later hanging up in the barn, and how they got there no one could fathom. If that were not indecipherable enough, things like hairbrushes, eyeglasses, handbags and even shoes would randomly just vanish and disappear, only to reappear in the most peculiar, odd places. One morning my mother found her handbag lying in the middle of a soya bean field, and a missing shoe was found in the oven, and the other one standing on the mantel. Then there were times we would hear fast feet going up and down hurriedly of the staircase, but it would seem that no one was there. One night when I was lying in bed, I was awoken to find the silhouettes of about 5 Victorian gentlemen standing around my bed in a cluster, staring at me. I could not observe their faces, but I could behold the dark silhouettes of their top hats and the outline of the shape of their bodies. I was so terrified that my heart was pounding violently in my chest, and my rapid breathing magnified in intensity. And I was so petrified and discomposed that I literally pulled the covers directly over my face to shelter myself from what I considered to be an impending threat. When I plucked up the courage to look again, they were still standing there, just gawking at me. I remember wondering what it was that they wanted from me, and why they would persist in this strange, odd behaviour of just staring and staring at me. It was so unsettling and disturbing. I was heartily relieved when after a few minutes they dematerialised before me, as fast as the flick of an electric light going on and off. This baffling, disturbing, erroneous event happened to me on multiple occasions, and my parents were not desperately empathetic towards my plight. When I did tell my mother what was happening to me, I observed that she would tell me that it was all my fertile imagination playing tricks with me, and that there was no such thing as ghosts. I wanted to believe her, but I was seeing these entities on a regular basis, and it was very discomposing, distressing and bewildering, and was most certainly not due to an active imagination on my part. My mother is a no-nonsense, very mathematical kind of woman who bases everything on science and math, and on things you physically can see. She has no time to contemplate airy-fairy stuff that she boldly ascertains is all stuff and nonsense, and belongs on the pages of pulp fiction. Despite the peculiar goings-on in our home, my mother emphatically believed there was a rational explanation for absolutely everything, although I must admit she never did quite understand how her handbag ended up in the middle of a soya bean field. As for my father, he was always very easy-going and laid back, and nothing ever frazed him. If he discerned something strange, he did not really give it a second thought, because he was so focused on the everyday practicalities of running the farm. My 2 sisters, who are considerably younger than I was at the time, talked about an eccentric, stylish Victorian gentleman in the house who wore a very big black hat and looked incredibly important. They said he would visit and play with them regularly. You could hear them talking to him incessantly, yabbering away all the time. "Yes, Mr. Barrows," they would say. "Would you like some tea, Mr. Barrows? Sit over there, Mr. Barrows." Day in and day out they'd talk incessantly about Mr. Barrows, and my mother grew very tired of their constant ramblings in regards to their invisible friend. Well, that's what she assumed he was. My sisters proclaimed that this kindly, elderly gentleman would always play with them when they were making up tea parties for their dolls. My mother thought she had raised children with heightened imaginations, but little did she realise that that was indeed far from the truth. All these years later, my sisters remember their visits from Mr. Burrows, whom they told my mother had a young 6-year-old daughter that had died of pneumonia in 1839. Imagine my mother's shock when she was to discover that there was indeed a Mr. Burrows' name literally registered on the deeds of our home, and she discovered he had a daughter that actually died of pneumonia in 1839. How could my sisters have known about that? But then that's another story in its own right, and despite all the evidence to the contrary, my mother still refused to believe in the paranormal. Growing up, my all-time favourite place to frequent was actually the woods, as they always made me feel incredibly calm and at peace, as well as so connected to the natural world, which was always so wondrous and exciting to behold, especially for a young boy like myself at the time, with an inquisitive, inquiring mind, and a large head for adventure. The greenwood on our land ended on the side of a large tarmac road, which was a shortcut to a highway which many locals used for quick access and convenience to get to the interstate. I would play out there on my own with a slingshot and explore. I loved to watch the wildlife, the insects and reptiles and any living thing that got my immediate attention. I would lift up rocks and leaves to see what lay beneath them. I'd also explore the stream bed, looking for fossils. I loved climbing trees, which was something I did very frequently, and the Sylvia was filled with a variety of interesting trees, from maples to longleaf pines, dogwoods, elms, sycamores and pawpaws, and the forest floor was covered in lily turf, sweet woodruff, wild ginger, and so much more. One day as I was playing in the far section of the Sylvan, close to the large road where the wood comes to a sudden abrupt end, I suddenly sensed that something very menacing and formidable was watching me. But what it was I could not imagine. All at once I saw it, and I was totally dumbstruck and mortified, because I've never encountered anything like this before. The only way I can describe it to you as a transparent humanoid. Imagine, for example, blowing a bubble. You can see the outer edges of the bubble very clearly, and also directly through it. This is what this translucent humanoid looked like. I could see the very clear outer edges of this human being, but looking through him, the images of the landscape looked rather distorted. This humanoid was about 6 foot tall and quite lean in shape, and its head and neck were very distinctive. It began chasing me, and I was so terrified because whatever in God's name this thing was, it was very terrifying and incredibly intimidating. It began to chase after me very fast, and I bolted across the road suddenly, and then I remember being hit by a passing car, and then after that everything goes blank in my memory. I'm grateful I didn't recall any pain, as I must have blacked out immediately. But I was so lucky to be alive, and I ended up having multiple surgeries, and in the end, I do not know exactly what they did to me, because all the medical technology stuff kind of blows over your head like a heavy wind, to be remembered no more. In short, I woke up rather bewildered and shocked to find myself in a hospital wing, and then all the memories of my horrifying experience with a demonical translucent humanoid came flooding back. I was horrified to learn that I'd run across the road and been hit by a car, and the driver in question was utterly devastated because she couldn't stop in time. She described me as tearing across the road like a bat out of hell. In short, I was to discover that I'd permanently lost the use of both of my legs, and I would be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of my life. My mother was livid and furious with me, especially because I'd gone bounding across that road, and even when I told her about the translucent being that had been chasing after me, she became angry, incensed and belligerent, and told me that my active imagination could have killed me, and that there was no such thing as a transparent humanoid. I was talking utter and total hogwash, and I should be ashamed of myself for making up such hocus pocus. Indeed, she was so concerned about my seemingly overactive imagination, so she went so far as to send me to a therapist who said that I was very level-headed with not much of an imagination, which really put a spanner in the works for my mother, and was nonsensical for her. You might have believed that being confined to a wheelchair would cause me to slip into a deep, sorrowful depression, but it would seem that I never allowed my infirmity to ever get me down. This could be a lot to do with my youthful resilience at the time. I think if it had happened to me now, it would be a great deal tougher for me to overcome. Before long, I was living a full life and learning to adapt with using a wheelchair. My father made the house more accessible for me, and even cleared pathways in the woods for my personal enjoyment, because he went out of a limb to make the farm as manageable as possible for me, as my disability was an impediment. At the time, he was getting some kind of a disabled motor designed especially for me to use around the house and in the farm. As my dad knew how much I just loved and adored the natural world, and he didn't want me to miss out on any of it. I was not going to allow a chance encounter with a translucent humanoid to rob me of enjoying the fruits of the grove again. That would be so ridiculous. Despite the fact that I do account this translucent being for being solely responsible for me losing the use of both of my legs. Of that I am assured. After I returned home, the visitations from those Victorian ghostly men with their top hats ceased, much to my relief and delight, and all the strange erroneous peculiarities subsided, but maybe after all the building alterations the house had finally settled down, and even my sisters ceased to see their Victorian friend any more. One day 2 of my cousins, Stephen and Cooper, came to stay on our farm during the autumn, as their aunt and uncle had gone to Germany to stay with relatives for a couple of weeks. Both my cousins were from Houston in Texas, and they loved coming to visit our little Kentucky farm. One day, as my cousins were taking me into the greenwoods by pushing my wheelchair along the cleared pathways, we were having a wonderful time together. My cousins would lift up rocks, and we would study what lay beneath them, and would watch squirrels darting up the trees, and also listen to the pretty bird song, and try to replicate their calls, with very little success, of course. Cooper was the one pushing my wheelchair. There was a gentle breeze blowing that morning, allowing the gold autumn leaves from some of the oak trees to cascade on the ground and rustle with the wind. Suddenly everything became eerily quiet, and I became quite unsettled for a moment. It was almost like the air was saturated with a sense of foreboding, and I sensed that something quite terrible was about to happen, but what I could not imagine. All of a sudden we could hear the sound of a tree being pushed over and falling to the ground with a mighty thud. And then there was a knocking sound as well as a rustling sound of leaves that were being crunched beneath very heavy feet as they moved ever forward. Whatever was moving around in that thicket had to be utterly enormous. "What the heck is that?" asked Cooper, looking at me as if he thought I'd have all the answers for him. "You know the woods," he persisted. "What is that?" I shrugged my shoulders. "Maybe a rotten tree fell over," I suggested rather lamely. "In this gentle breeze," said Cooper, looking incredibly doubtful. "Surely not." "Look," said Stephen suddenly. "I saw something over there. It was moving." We looked in the direction where Stephen was pointing, but saw absolutely nothing. "There is nothing there, Stephen," snapped Cooper. "Stop trying to scare us. It's not funny, Stephen." "I'm telling you, I saw something," insisted Steve. "I really wasn't making it up." "Look, there it is again," he said. "Over there." At first, all I could see was a tree swaying as if something was pushing it backwards and forwards with deliberate intent. I could also discern between the tree line a rather dark, shadowy form of something very, very big, hefty and brawly. We beheld a hazy silhouette of a dark gargantuan mass moving between the trees, and we could feel the mysterious critter's predacious and predatory gaze on us, making us feel like vulnerable mice beneath the sharp, piercing eyes of a very discerning, marauding owl that was about to plunder and pounce on us at any given moment. The question was, which one of us was on the menu today? I knew that I was easy pickings because I couldn't walk. I was beginning to feel an impending sense of dread as memories of my former petrifying encounter with the translucent humanoid came racing back into my mind like a Lamborghini on full throttle. I could feel that dreadful, dull, familiar ache of foreboding coursing through my veins as my heart began to pound in my chest at an alarmingly fast rate. "What the heck is that?" said Cooper again, his eyes growing as round as saucers. "It's built like a tank, whatever it is." Suddenly we could hear the creature moving towards us as heavy feet crunched the leaves, and we heard a grunt, and then the most terrifying whooping sound that literally sent shivers down my spine. "He's coming!" cried Cooper, turning my wheelchair around as quickly as he could to run with me seated in the chair, which is a challenge at the very best of times. Suddenly the creature came tearing towards us like a rhino charging through the thicket, and as Cooper pushed my wheelchair, he lost his balance and coordination in his terror. He must have pushed my wheelchair over the edge of the path, where it toppled over and I was flung down the slight hilly elevation, only to land on a soft patch of undergrowth below. Fortunately, the forest underbrush seemingly supported my weight, rather like a mattress. Using the strength of my arm and upper torso, I cautiously slid my body towards a tree trunk to balance my back against the trunk for support. I was grateful that I had not been hurt, and I was no worse for wear. I could hear Cooper and Stephen screaming at the top of their lungs and sprinting away from the sylvan as fast as they could, with the animal running behind them. But then the critter turned around and retreated back to the grove. In that moment I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was the mouse that didn't get away. I watched this huge colossal being bounding down the slight hilly elevation towards me with powerful, strong, tree-trunk-sized legs that were literally bent at the knees. I was so terrified I squeezed my eyes as tightly as I could, waiting for that harrowing blow to end my life. It would all be over very soon, and it was now out of my control to do anything about it now. People often ask what it feels like in the instant before you believe you're going to die. I can assure you that I've come to realize that the human spirit is far tougher than we give it credit for. You see, as I was certain I was about to pass away, it would seem a huge sense of peaceful repose, serenity and acceptance literally washed over me like a soft, gentle tide that embraces your feet with its cool, refreshing water. I'm pretty certain this happens to everybody in life and death scenarios, which is comforting to know concerning our loved ones, should they pass away suddenly in an unforeseen, fortuitous accident, which I hope never happens. As I waited, nothing transpired, and I quickly opened my eyes to see the monstrous beast just staring at me and regarding me intently with his big eyes. But he wasn't behaving like a creature that actually wanted to kill me, but rather like someone that wanted to play with me instead. Now that wasn't what I was expecting at all. I was utterly astounded that something this terrifying to look at, that could make a noise worse than a lion's roar, could appear so playful and congenial. I suddenly realised I was definitely staring at a Bigfoot. There has been so much TV coverage about Sasquatch over the years, and there were people all over North America desirous of an encounter, and this hairy humanoid was standing only yards away from me. I studied the critter intently, trying to memorise every detail of its biology, so that I would never ever forget it. I have never been good on measurements, but as a rough estimate, I suppose the critter was over 7 foot tall, 600 pounds, and possibly 3 foot wide, with a typical overlong arms, massive shoulders, and cone-shaped head that they always talk about. He was covered in the blackest hair that I have ever seen, that in certain lights almost possessed a navy blue hue. The hair was long and very thick. The critter had a vertical face and flat nose, wrinkled brow ridge, and deep-set, dark, cheerful, jovial eyes. He looked like an ape-man because it was both these vital characteristics, both ape and man, that were depicted in his biological makeup and physical appearance. To look at, the critter was terrifying. Anyone with half a brain would have fled from the critter in an instant, of that I'm sure, but I was not privy to that advantage, as you can appreciate. I hasten to add that the noises he made also were very intimidating, yet he was anything but aggressive. There wasn't a mean bone in his entire body, and this became very evident to me. Before long I felt incredibly relaxed in his company, and completely forgot my paralysing fear. The critter reached for a pine cone and began throwing it to me, and before long we began to play ball together. All the while the critter kept chattering, and sometimes he'd make this loud whooping sound that after a while I didn't find too bad. I think for a Bigfoot he possessed quite an outgoing, friendly personality. They can be reticent, I gather. All the while we played together he chatted away non-stop, as if he expected me to understand every word, and he sounded like he was really enjoying our interaction. I began speaking to him in my human language, and we had a two-way dialogue like two people speaking different languages, like German and French together, without understanding a word. One thing I'm in no doubt about, and that was that this Bigfoot was highly intelligent, and I knew that from the very moment I met him. Knowing what I know now, I would regard shooting a Bigfoot like killing a human being, because this critter was so human in many ways it was rather uncanny. It was like I was in the presence of a very dear friend. The critter squatted down on the ground and proceeded to show me one of his feet where he was missing a toe, and he began to chat garrulously away, as he was clearly telling me how he'd lost his toe. But I just nodded because I didn't understand a word he was saying. But based on his expressions and gestures, what he was telling me was one hell of a story, so I really wish I'd understood it. I discerned that his feet were really rather enormous, but they were padded with very strong skin that you see on your cat's paws at the bottom, or a predator in the wild like a lion or a tiger. Very tough skin indeed. Suddenly I could hear my dad coming towards the woods, and I immediately indicated for the critter to go quickly, but he was already out of there like greased lightning, and needed little encouragement to escape. I've never seen anything move that fast before. "What the heck happened?" asked my father, running down the embankment to where I was sitting. "Your cousin said a monster was chasing you, and that you fell over." "Monster?" I laughed. "I can't imagine what they're talking about. I think there was a black bear loitering around, but he was startled by something, that's all. You know how skittish they can be." "That's the problem with city boys," said my dad. "They're so quick to overreact. If they see a mouse, it's a lion. A bat, it's a vulture. A lizard, and it's a crocodile." We laughed as my dad picked me up and replaced me into the wheelchair. "City boys," he joked. "They've a lot to learn about the country and how things pan out around here. "I thought you were a goner," said Cooper, racing towards me. "I know I shouldn't have left you stranded there, but I was so frightened I couldn't stay. I thought the creature was going to kill us. Did you see the monster? Steve thinks it could have been a Bigfoot that we saw." "What are you talking about?" I said. "What monster? There was no monster. It was just a bear." "Are you sure?" said Cooper. "I'm not sure you're right about that." "Very, very sure," I insisted. Cooper and Steve did not look convinced, but they never said another word. I do not know why I lied to both of my cousins and also to my father. I think I felt remarkably protective towards the Bigfoot. I really liked the critter, and I didn't want anyone in the world to hurt him. It's hard to explain, but my encounter was so personal and so special that it touched me in such a monumental way that is so deeply special to me. I did do some research and discovered that I'm not the first person to encounter these translucent humanoids that some consider to be some kind of a cloaking system. Some people even think that they might be actually Bigfoots. Whatever it was, I hope and pray that I never encounter it again. But as for the Bigfoot, I do hope to see him one day soon. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Bernice, but everybody who knows me calls me Bernie, and I'm from Georgia, where I was raised by both my grandparents on their country farm that has been in my family line for generations, where we grow peanuts. It's a federal-looking red brick two-storey farmhouse which possesses similar features to a Georgian home with classical symmetry and a side-gabled roof, but it's a little bit more ornate-looking and slightly taller and narrower. The house has white wooden double-hung windows, grey shutters and a grey roof, with fancy decorative undertrim, and about 3 red brick steps that lead to a stylish white front door that's framed on either side by very ornate columns and a rectangular overtrim. Our farm is surrounded by undulating green valleys and dotted with ubiquitous trees and a pond and a creek, as well as our own pristine greenwood full of sycamores, pines, dogwoods and hemlock trees, which are a haven for the indigenous wildlife like whitetails, raccoons, squirrels, foxes, bears, and the list goes on and on. I was removed from both my parents shortly after I was born, as both of them were drug addicts and were not deemed reliable enough to raise me. I'm heartily grateful that this finite decision was actually made on my behalf, as I dread to imagine where I would be today if that had not been the case. My biological grandparents on my mother's side were given sole custody in raising me as their own daughter. I was to learn that both biological parents of mine had lived in their shabby car, been homeless, slept rough, and on countless occasions OD'd on drugs. Sometimes my mother and her boyfriend, who was in fact my biological father, would actually get permission to come and visit me. I never considered them to be my parents. I remember my mother was the most scary-looking woman that I've ever seen. Her bedraggled, unkempt, slovenly appearance really terrified me as a young girl. She appeared to be so skeletal, and her atrophied bones were sticking out of her anemic flesh, rather like fragile daggers. Her haggard, wrinkled face was drawn and pinched, with hollow, indented cheekbones. If that wasn't bad enough, I promise you that her dull hair hung around her face in lifeless dreadlocks. Even her bloodshot eyes were rimmed with dark shadows. I noticed she wore a nose ring and possessed a tattoo on her arm of a skull and crossbones, which I thought was very sinister. As for my ungrounded, draggle-tailed father, he was always so dithery and spaced out. He looked like he was in another world. On one occasion I vividly recall that he was stroking a hydrangea bush, kissing and fondling it in the front yard. I actually asked my grandmother why he was displaying so much affection towards the bush. I heard my grandmother say, "Good grief! I've never seen anything like this before." She watched my father's antics through the window with a look of horror on her face. I don't believe she could quite comprehend what she was actually observing. I could tell that she was horrified by the inappropriate erotic love scene unfolding before our very eyes. It really looked like my enamoured father was having a lustful, very inappropriate love affair with a hydrangea bush, and he seemed to display amorous affection towards it by stroking it and looking at it with a bedazzled, besotted look on his face, and his impassioned behaviour got my grandmother all heated and fired up, especially when he kept telling the hydrangea bush over and over again how beautiful it was. "You're so beautiful! Oh, so beautiful, beautiful!" he drawled, stroking the leaves away gently as if they were locks of hair on a woman's face. My grandfather, who was watching this passionate display of unbridled affection, and jovially joked that hydrangeas must indeed look rather desirable in a drugged hallucinatory state. My grandmother immediately chastised him for not being at all funny. "Look what a complete fool the man is making of himself. Never in a month of Sundays have I seen such ridiculous, obscene behaviour. The man is completely off his head. He's an embarrassment to himself." On another occasion I saw my delusional dad peeing over our white cat Snowball that was lying on the white couch fast asleep in the living room. The poor cat got the shock of her life when she was hosed down by my dad. The cat sprang up, lashed at my dad with her powerful claws, glaring at him with big yellow eyes, growling, and then bolted out of the living room like a rocket off a launch pad. My grandmother was furious with my dad. "What did you do that for?" she shrieked. "You've just peed over my beautiful Persian cat, and my couch too." "I thought it was a toilet bowl," he apologised. "It's a cat, for goodness sake," she snapped. "Get a pair of eyes, will you? Those drugs are doing all the seeing for you these days." "This isn't a good bat," she told my gran. "It's hard to distinguish with what is real and what's not sometimes, and it did look like a toilet bowl," he protested. "I mean, it's all white, the couch and the cat." "She's a white cat," snapped my gran, "not a toilet seat." "Well, if you didn't do drugs," my grandmother informed him, "you might actually have a life and begin to live in the real world, and use the correct facilities for your ablutions." Both my biological parents, without wishing to be unkind, looked like dossers or vagrants, as they wore soiled, worn-out, smelly clothes that were blistered with holes and tears. I noticed when they visited me, I never got the impression that they were the slightest bit interested in actually seeing me. Their visit would mask a rather insidious motive, and I wasn't wrong. You see, they really didn't care about anything else in the world other than the next high that they would get from their drugs. They preferred to sleep rough rather than pay rent in order to procure more drugs. I never asked what they were taking, but I knew enough to know that even if you paid me $1 billion, I would not travel down that insidiously evil path. If my parents weren't so pathetic, I would have almost felt sorry for them. When they visited the farm, I do remember the growing tension in the air would be heightened and overwrought. My grandmother would become aggrieved, twitchy and stressed out. I would always sense that some kind of argument was ensuing, and my mother would storm out, screaming at my grandmother with cursory words that are not repeatable. I would watch my fuming parents climb into their battered, ruined-down old car. They would accelerate down the driveway at a mighty speed, causing the tyres to screech. After they had actually gone, I would look at my grandmother and could see that she had become so relieved. I would watch the crinkles on her brows straighten out as she visibly began to relax. I was to learn when I was older that my biological parents were always asking for money and handouts. They had literally cleaned my grandparents out on multiple occasions in the past by stealing televisions, jewellery and items of value that they would be able to pawn in exchange for money. I gather that they'd been arrested on multiple occasions stealing property from other people to support their out-of-control addiction. It grieved my grandparents' heart, as you can imagine, to turn their backs on their beloved daughter, but they believed that they had a moral responsibility to raise me in a very stable family environment, and did not want the negative influences of my parents' drug-ridden lifestyle to drag me down or influence me negatively. On the contrary, it did the very opposite, as if you see the ramifications for what drugs can do to people, you would give them a wide berth. My grandparents' old-world farmhouse is delightfully charming, with lots of quirky character, and it's an old colonial home surrounded by pristine green turf that's manicured to perfection, a beautiful silvery pond, and a scattering of trees that border the perimeters of the long gravel driveway that winds its way to a large paved parking bay. The house itself has a colonial patio where statuesque decorative columns support the covered ceiling, and there are central steep steps that lead to an embossed decorative front door. Every window in our house overlooks magnificent views of hazy blue mountains that silhouette and frame the far distance of our property in undulating rectangular waves. The farm possesses prairies of idyllic grassland, meadows, white-poled fences, barns, ponds, and a large area of natural wood green that stretches back quite a way, with a meandering stream that jets through the valley, gushing over the rugged outcrops with a powerful, forceful current. In the 1800s, cotton was grown on my grandparents' property, and later it became a free-range chicken farm. But my grandmother did not like the smell, and so they decided to grow organic vegetables and raise orchards of peaches here instead. In those days, my grandfather developed a passion for beekeeping, and so we produced a great deal of our own honey, and it became a thriving, enterprising and productive business for us. My strange, rather peculiar story I'm about to share with you unfortunately didn't happen to me personally, but it happened to my grandmother on this very same farm when she was a teenage girl at the time. I only learnt about her story in 2010, when I was 17 years old. My grandmother was always a voracious, very fast knitter, and in the evening she would sit in the television room knitting away while I'd fiddle restlessly with the television control, scanning through all the television programmes, looking for something for us to watch, while my grandfather would be out playing bridge with some friends of his. "For goodness sake, sweetheart," my grandmother would chide, "you're worse than your grandfather, pressing the control every second. You're driving me stark raving mad. For goodness sake, find something decent for us to watch, and stop clicking that control." One day my grandmother and I began to watch a programme on television about strange mysteries in Northern America, and one of the stories was all about the Yeti or the Sasquatch. Suddenly my grandmother's knitting needles began clicking very, very fast, and I heard her say, "Oh, I've dropped a stitch." I turned around to look at my grandmother in surprise, because she's never ever dropped stitches. That just doesn't happen. She's such a proficient knitter. When I looked at her, I knew something was off, and she was hiding something from me. It was like the story of the Yeti had somehow triggered a memory for her that she had repressed for some reason or other. "Do you think the Yeti is real?" I asked her, studying her expression ever so carefully. "Of course not," she said hurriedly, as if trying to avoid the question. "There's no such thing." I knew by my grandmother's telltale mannerisms that she was lying, and she wasn't good at telling untruths. "Gran," I said, "you've seen one, haven't you? I know you have." My grandmother was very reticent, contained sort of person, and getting her to tell you something very personal was like extracting blood from a stone. But after hours of constant badgering, her resistance wore thin. She finally conceded and confirmed that she had indeed encountered a Yeti, or a Bigfoot once, if you like, and I begged and begged her to tell me her story, until finally she did. "I can do better than that," she said to me, and went to retrieve a diary of hers. My grandmother did not keep diaries like normal folk do, that recorded their daily events one day after another. My grandmother's diaries were extra special because she only ever recorded the events of great significance in her life that she never wanted to forget. So this is the story she wrote in her diary, which I will now relate to you and your listeners in her own words. July 23rd, 1966. Yesterday, the 22nd of July, 1966. The day started like any normal day. I hadn't anticipated anything of an unusual nature happening or occurring. As usual, I woke up early and Mother was bustling around the kitchen and frying eggs and bacon sunny side up. The sizzling sweet smoky aroma wafted around the kitchen, permeating the air. If I wasn't hungry, I was now. Mother placed some bacon on a plate for me and poured me a yummy glass of chocolate milk, fresh from Morgan Roper's dairy herd, and it was absolutely delicious. Father had his head engrossed in the newspaper as usual and began to chuckle as he read out an article for us. "Listen to this," he laughed. "Farmer refuses to send his heifer to slaughter. Farmer Joe, like any other cattle rancher, has been raising heifers for many years, and his farm produces very fine quality lean succulent meat that would please the most discerning of palates. However, this year Farmer Joe is not sending one of his heifers called Chantilly Lace to the slaughterhouse. 'I can't do it,' he said. 'Chantilly Lace is one of the family now. She behaves just like a dog. She's affectionate and attentive. She rubs her large head against me and licks my bald patch with her long tongue. And the absent hair has grown back due to the follicle stimulation. I've never seen results like this before, and people are all commenting on the extraordinary miraculous regrowth of my hair, and it's all down to Chantilly Lace's massaging tongue. Farmer Joe says it's not just because my hair is growing back that I want to keep Chantilly Lace. It is by no means a vanity issue, but I'm just far too attached to her, and so are my wife and kids. If I sent her to the slaughterhouse, even my dogs would refuse to talk to me, because they also have taken to the heifer. She romps around with them, thinking she's a dog. She prefers to hang around us than with the rest of the herd. I've raised hundreds of heifers before, but Chantilly Lace is one in a million. They broke the mould when they made her. I don't think she even knows that she's actually a heifer. We think that the man protests too much, and the regrowth of his hair has increased his attachment to the feisty heifer. What do you think? We all began to laugh as Father read the article, and Mother suggested that he should visit Chantilly Lace for a head massage. You could do with a little follicle stimulation, she teased, rubbing his bald patch. I could tell Father was not terribly amused or best pleased by my mother's brutal remark. He was always rather sensitive about losing his hair. It was about 11 o'clock when I told Mother I was going into the woods for some fresh air before luncheon to work up an appetite, and she told me it was a very good idea, because Father Lee Jones and his wife from church would be joining us for luncheon that day. I was bitterly disappointed because Father Lee is such a talkative person who always speaks in a monotone voice and reminds me of a droning lawnmower that just won't shut up. He goes on and on and on and on. As for his wife, I don't believe I've ever heard her say anything beyond, "Yes, dear." I think she's positively the most boring person that I've ever had the pleasure to meet. Why Mother keeps inviting them both over for lunch, goodness only knows. Maybe she wants a part in the church choir and is buttering him up. I wouldn't put anything past her. As I was meditating upon the tedium of lunch spent with that boring couple, I did determine that the woods had become very quiet. Even the trees failed to sway and rustle against the gentle breeze. The birdsong in the valley was not audible to my ears. I could hear the sound of the gushing stream meandering through the woods as the jets of boisterous water cascaded against the rocky outcrops. On this occasion it seemed louder than usual, possibly because everything else was airily still and very quiet. I did think it was decidedly odd, but I pondered no further upon the matter. I did, however, detect a musty smell in the woods that smelt like a damp towel or wet dog, so to speak, that had gone rather rank and mouldy. Suddenly I heard a snapping and huge screaming sound, unlike anything I've heard before. I knew immediately that one of Armstrong's illegal bear traps had gone off. Father has warned Armstrong time and time again that if he makes any more of those horrible homemade contraptions, that there will be hell to pay. I honestly don't know why my father did not get rid of the manic, insane Armstrong an awfully long time ago. The man's not right in the head. He's always making these ghastly, barbaric contraptions for trapping bears. They look like instruments of torture that are used in medieval times, that would be illegal if anyone uncovered what he was doing. He'd get into so much trouble. Weeks ago, poor Farmer Morris actually got his foot caught up in one of these gruesome traps, and he nearly lost it. Did the bull-headed Armstrong learn anything from that fiasco? Not at all. On the contrary, he continues to invent more and more of these ghastly, insidious and grotesquely evil traps. If I didn't know any better, I'd hasten to say that the man rather enjoys the savage and brutal way that he traps animals, which in my opinion is heinous and cruel. Hearing that horrible noise go off, I knew at once that someone was caught up in one of Armstrong's grievously evil traps. And whoever they were, it was most certainly not a bear. It sounded rather human-like. I knew that my father would finally be giving Armstrong his marching orders, and it couldn't come soon enough as far as I was concerned. Even his own wife told me once she won't let her husband anywhere near their cat, because she can't trust him to be gentle with the thing. I decided I needed to help the individual, whoever they were, that was stuck in the trap, as I more or less knew how to take Armstrong's medieval traps apart. Nothing on God's earth was to prepare me for what I was about to see. As I approached the area of the painful grunts, standing in the bear trap with one foot in the ghastly contraption, was a colossal creature that bore a remarkable resemblance to a great ape, but it wasn't an ape. And it also bore a resemblance to a human, but it wasn't a human either. It was as if he was a combination of both man and beast. There are no words to describe what I saw to you, for he was a giant equal in strength to 4 men. He was about as wide and as big as our front door. I did discern that the beast was powerfully strong, for his body was made of solid, brawn, sinewy muscle, and was covered with long silvery grey hair, in all areas with the exception of the knees, the sides of his torso and face. I did determine that the weathered rough skin on his face was a deep grey colour, with lots of deep wrinkles, and his nose was flat on the face, with 2 open flares, and the mouth was long and very thin. I could see that the critter's large foot was ensnared in the trap, and he was trying to shake it off brutally with his foot, but every time he did this the trap tightened, and caused the poor humanoid creature a great deal of pain. He was wincing a lot. I wanted to help the creature, but he was so terrifying to contemplate. I couldn't just leave him in the trap, though. He was now pulling it back with his fingers, which could potentially snap off if he wasn't careful. "No!" I cried, raising my arms and venturing towards the creature. The creature looked up at me in surprise, and he winced. I could see the physical pain in his eyes, and I knew he was hurting, and I couldn't stomach the critter being in pain. My heart melted like butter, and despite my anguish and terrible fear, I no longer cared. I had to help this critter because it was so human-looking, and I couldn't leave it like this. I ran boldly towards the critter, no longer fearing for my own safety, as sometimes in life it's worth being a little courageous, and it certainly paid off for me in more ways than I could imagine that day. The critter began bending back the metal of the trap. I was astonished. How could he be strong enough to bend metal? Who can do that? Such was the strength of this creature. "No," I said, "don't do that. It could snap off your finger." I began to loosen the trap from the creature, as I knew exactly how the horrendous contraption worked, and I released the mechanism. The creature finally loosened its foot and stared at me in awe. I've never seen such a huge foot before, and it was actually bleeding quite badly. I felt very sorry for the creature. For a while the critter and I just stared at each other, and his golden eyes held my gaze for a very long time. His eyes expressed appreciation that I'd helped him, but also a very deep, gentle kindness that was so tangible I could feel it. He was definitely congenial and remarkably intelligent. I said to the creature, "Does it hurt?" And he looked at me with his beautiful warm eyes, and I melted like chocolate. I forgot that I was even afraid of him. He was scary and terrifying to perceive, based on his Herculean size and intimidating presence, yet his heart, I knew instinctively, was exceedingly good, and there was not even an ounce of malice in his demeanour. It was like the outer package did not correlate with his heart, for on the outside he was majestic, lofty and powerful like an apex predator, but the inside he was soft as a marshmallow. After a while the critter turned and indicated to me that he had to leave, and I watched him limping away. When I returned home for luncheon, I sat there in a dreamlike state, reliving my encounter with the marvellous creature, and wondering what on earth it was that he could be. I did not hear a word that the garrulous Father Lee had to say. I grinned at him and nodded, locked in my own fantasy world. Even my mother commented that I seemed less frustrated with Father Lee on this occasion, but she had no idea what was going on in my mind. If she had known, she would have been horrified. I told Father that I'd found Armstrong's homemade traps lying around the forest, and I was to find out there were others all equally as grievous and tortuous, hidden amidst the forest shrubbery. Father immediately dismissed him, and about time too. As I write this, I hope in my heart to see that extraordinary creature again, but I do not believe it is likely, but I know that I shall never ever forget him as long as I live. I shall not tell anybody what I've seen, and I highly doubt that if I did, they would even believe me. I will never forget his pyramid-shaped head, large shoulders and angular face, with the most beautiful eyes that I have ever beheld. P.S. Footnote. 5 days have passed since I last saw the creature, but my mother found several eagle feathers on our doorstep and wondered where on earth they'd come from. I took them from her at once, telling her they were for me, because I knew that they were. I can hardly believe that the creature brought me a gift. I'm so happy, because eagle feathers are a token of strength and power, and I shall definitely treasure them all my life. So there you are. That was my grandmother's personal story. I was to learn that she never saw the Bigfoot again, which was why she was so upset watching the documentary on the Yeti. She was very cross and incensed because the person talking about the Sasquatch kept claiming that they were all nasty, vicious, dangerous monsters. My grandmother vehemently believes that this is not the case. He was so kind, she protested, so kind. And his eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. They were beautiful. They're so misunderstood, she said. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Hugh and I'm from Alberta in Western Canada, where the exquisite landscape here encompasses mountains, prairies, desert badlands and coniferous forests. My family is from Lethbridge, which has a very small town feel about it, as people are very congenial and friendly in this part of the world. But there is the added convenience of close access to all the local amenities that you can find when you're in an urban metropolis, from restaurants, coffee shops and schools. The climate in Lethbridge consists of pleasant warm summers and mild winters due to its close proximity to the Canadian Rockies. Growing up, we lived in the southern part of town, in the Cooley Creek neighbourhood, in a ranch-style home, in a rectangular U-shaped house, with whitewashed walls, low-pitched grey roofs, with wide eaves and a large patio area, which is quite commonplace. I grew up here with both my loving, attentive parents and older sister Letitia, and I can honestly say we really did have an idyllic childhood, with so much outdoor spaces where we could explore, camp and hike, as there was an abundance of recreational activities to enjoy and appreciate, so we were never short of interesting things to do as a family. My bizarre, curious story begins when I was going on a field camp with about 19 other boys in my year at school with our biology teacher, Mr. Anderson, and I was incredibly excited. I was about 11 years old at the time, which was in 1996. Mr. Anderson was the most beloved teacher in our entire school. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that everybody loved him, and even the parents thought he was an incredibly cool dude. He was quirky and eccentric, with a great sense of humour. At school he transformed every single biology lesson into a work of art, and made our studies become so alive that every boy in the class would hang on to his every word, as if it was the gospel. We listened to him speak with such passion and unbridled enthusiasm of the natural world, which was so contagious that every boy in our class, irrespective of their academic prowess, always ended up getting excellent grades. Mr. Anderson was one of those exceptional teachers and made no apologies for his unconventional teaching style. And even the headmaster of our school confessed that if there were indeed more teachers like Mr. Anderson around, there would be absolutely no failed pupils. Mr. Anderson was in his early 60s and was strong, well-built, athletic and very nimble. He was a good-looking gentleman and was one of those people that actually improved with age, much like a good wine. He had silvery hair and bright hazel eyes. He told me once he'd never been married because in his younger days he would jet-set all over the globe on intrepid, exciting adventures. He didn't want to be tied down with a family and kids at that stage of his life. Whilst all his friends were getting married and raising families, Mr. Anderson was climbing mountains, exploring rainforests, visiting remote villages and indigenous people, and some of the stories he shared with us about his exciting adventures were quite simply mind-blowing. Mr. Anderson regularly organised about 3 field trips a year with his classes. They weren't compulsory, of course, but every boy in our class would never turn down a camping trip with Mr. Anderson. You'd have to be mad to do so, because invariably you'd be missing out on one hell of an adventure. So there we were, out in the idyllic natural world, camping with Mr. Anderson, our all-time favourite teacher. We pitched 6 4-man tents, one specifically for Mr. Anderson to occupy, while every other tent was inhabited by 4 boys per tent. We prepared a large fire pit and placed a couple of loose tree limbs around the area for seating purposes, and they were very comfortable indeed. Our campsite overlooked a ravishing aquamarine lake, which gets its exquisite turquoise colour from the retraction of rock flour that flows into the lake during the summer months, so very typical of lakes here in the Rockies, most especially the famous Lake Louise, which is indeed something spectacular to behold. The glistening lake that surrounded our campsite looked like a sparkling, glittering sapphire, reflecting all the panoramic views of the mountains, the clouds, glaciers and trees upon its gleaming surface like a shimmering mirror. This precious jewel was set against a panoramic backdrop of the most majestic silhouettes of tall, imposing mountains with such rugged, interesting triangular ridges that in themselves were like great works of sculpture. Then there were the tall, alpine, verdant trees that were dotted together in sumptuous carpets of green. Our camp overlooked the lake and was surrounded on either side by an undulating prairie filled with green turf and pretty spring flowers, and on the rear of our campsite were forests of trees that stretched back for many miles, with hiking trails literally everywhere. We couldn't have asked to be in a more sublime, idyllic and tranquil place, and it's so easy to be completely mesmerised by these incredible views. On the first day of our trip, Mr. Anderson gave us each our own glass bottle and asked us to collect a living insect, so we could discuss what it was that we'd actually found. And so off we went to search for our insects, teaming up with one other person on our search. My partner was Matt, who was my very best friend in school, so it was naturally reasonable that we would team up together. Matt collected a lady beetle, and I found the most exquisite butterfly and placed it in a screw-cap bottle with air holes and a few flowers to sit on. Before long we were discussing all the insects in detail, from bugs to grasshoppers and centipedes. "Why did you choose a butterfly, Hugh?" Mr. Anderson asked me. "Well, sir," I said, "I think they're rather beautiful. I like the fact that they actually metamorphosize. They go from being a caterpillar that is limited in its movements to a period of time spent in a cocoon, only to emerge from their confinement totally transformed. I like that, sir. I like the fact that the butterfly can fly over great distances, and they're free. If I were an insect, sir, I would definitely choose to be a butterfly." "Well put," said Mr. Anderson. "I couldn't have put it better myself. What about you, Matty? Why did you choose a lady beetle?" "Well, sir," said Matt, looking very, very serious, "ladybugs are very, very lucky. One day my mother found a ladybug on her handbag, and later in the day, sir, she came into some very good news about a sizable inheritance that she hadn't been expecting to receive from an aunt of hers. She didn't believe the aunt even liked her. Another time, sir, there was a ladybug on our car, and my mother ran through a red light, and the officer let her off with a warning, and she didn't have to pay a fine. So they are very lucky, sir. I also like the red colour and the black dots. I think they're also pretty." "Well, that's very interesting, Matt. I did like your definition." So after everybody had discussed the insects that they had caught in great detail, as usual it would seem that Mr. Anderson's rather quirky, outlandish and eccentric way of teaching had us all riveted and inspired. After we finished our discussions at great length, we finally set our insects free and then went for a long hike. We returned to camp to cook and prepare our meat over the fire pit. By this time we were famished. We watched in awe as the sun set over the valley, buttering it in tangerines, orange and golds, and after the soft orange contours ebbed and faded away, a mellow dusky darkness veiled our campsite, welcoming in the night, and before long the vast firmament was dotted with twinkling stars and a bright ivory moon, and we could hear the sounds of croaking frogs and singing crickets serenading the night with their soulful chatter. "It's a full moon," said Mr. Anderson, pointing towards the sky. "Did you know that people can be much more intense and very emotional during a full moon?" "No, sir," I said. "I didn't know that." "Oh, it's a scientific fact," reflected Mr. Anderson. "Even the hospitals know about it. There are many more emergencies on a full moon." Before long we were seated by a crackling fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. "Who has a good ghost story for us?" asked Mr. Anderson. "We have to have a good story around the fire, as it's a prerequisite for a good camp." "I have, sir," said a young boy called Robbie. "Well, in a manner of speaking, I have." "Go on," said Mr. Anderson. "We're all waiting attentively." "Well, sir, my mother told me this story," he said. "It's a true story, sir. She was driving home in blizzard conditions, and it was very cold, and everything was carpeted in thick snow. The wind was punnelling against my mother's window violently and beating against her car incredibly hard. All of a sudden she saw this young woman, who was wearing a soft gown in these treacherous Arctic icy conditions, walking on her own in the snow. My mother was mortified to see this poor woman wearing a summery dress in these freezing weather conditions. My mother stopped her car immediately and offered the woman a lift. She said it was very odd, because the woman was not even shivering with cold. She didn't even appear to be freezing. My mother said that the woman had a radiance about her, something that was really quite strange. She said it wasn't of this world, and began to talk to her in a musical voice, telling her all kinds of things about her life that she couldn't possibly have known. She told my mother to have a lot of courage, because everything would be fine in the end. You see, my mother had breast cancer at the time, sir, and no one knew about her condition, but now she's fine, with no sign of cancer any more. But she said the car suddenly started to skid violently, sir. It lost traction. It should have rolled over the rocky ridge, but it didn't. And even though it didn't have guardrails at the time, it should have rolled over. But it actually just bounced back on its wheels, and was back in the middle of the road as if nothing had happened, sir. She turned around to say to the woman, 'Did you see that?' Because she knew what had just happened, but when she turned around, sir, the woman had just vanished, disappeared from her sight. She looked around, but the woman was nowhere to be seen, sir. My mother believes that it was an angel that protected her from having a very serious accident that could ultimately have killed her. She was certain about that, sir." "A wonderful story, Matt," said Mr. Anderson. "I do believe in angels. I believe that they can intervene in our lives, especially when they need to rescue us from perilous conditions, when it's not our time to leave the earth plane, that is." "Do you think our time is determined, Mr. Anderson?" I asked. "Oh, I do, son," he said. "I really do. But I could be wrong, of course." "Anyone else with a story?" he asked, "especially a ghost story." "Well, mine's a ghost story, sir, but it's not as nice as hers," said another boy called Cole. "My older sister Frederica is completely nuts, sir. She's so fascinated about ghosts. She actually frequents all those haunted places that you hear about, sir, and she regularly visits graveyards." "I can't say I blame her. I love graveyards," said Mr. Anderson. "I enjoy looking at those old gravestones from bygone days. I love reading the names on the graves and when the person died. It fascinates me for some bizarre reason." "Exactly like my sister, sir. She could spend hours in a graveyard and never get bored. One day she was meeting two of her friends in the graveyard. Other people meet in coffee shops, sir, but never my sister nor her friends. They like to chat around the graves, and they smoke cigarettes and drink swigs of cream brandy, which they pass around to each other while they chat and giggle and laugh. My mother thinks it's very inappropriate, distasteful and disrespectful, but my sister doesn't care. She says it's all a free world and she can do what she likes. She's nonconformist, sir, and very opinionated about absolutely everything." "I know what you mean," laughed Mr. Anderson. "A free spirit, that's what your sister is. And there's nothing wrong with being individualistic and unique. It makes the world a much more interesting place. It most certainly does. Go on with your story, Cole. We're all listening." "Well, one day my sister got to the graveyard early. She saw this dark female figure floating above the grave and then merging into it and disappearing. She said it was the most sinister, evil-looking thing that she'd ever seen in her life, sir. This happened in broad daylight, not at night, so it freaked my sister out. But she waited for her friends to tell them what she'd seen. But they all wanted to stay at the graveyard in the hope that they'd see it too, because they thought it would be so exciting to observe. But the ghostly spectre never actually reappeared. But it doesn't end there, sir, because when my sister came home, my mother even noticed that the house seemed darker and heavier, almost oppressive if you like. Everyone felt it for an entire week, and even my father, who never notices anything, commented that something was really off at home. Everyone in the house felt uneasy and certain that they were being watched by unseen eyes, but we never saw anything. One night our entire household was awoken to my sister screaming, and we raced into her bedroom. I've never been so scared, sir, as I was certain someone had broken into our house and was trying to murder my sister. My frantic father was trembling as he loaded his rifle, and we all rushed into her room. Sir, I've never seen my sister so frightened in all my life. Her face had grown an ashen white colour, and there were red claw marks around her neck, as if something evil had been attacking her violently, like a savage mountain lion or something with claws. My father asked her what the heck had happened. She told us that this evil, insidious woman from the graveyard that she'd seen the week prior had been hovering above her and trying to strangle her to death. She said she tried to fight the demonical entity back, but was completely powerless to do so. It was as if her body froze over like a block of ice. We all believed her because our house had become so menacing in the past few days after her macabre encounter. The long and the short of it, sir, was that the house was cleansed and blessed, and the medium who visited our home told us that my sister had brought that demonical entity back from the graveyard. Oh, it was the most awful thing, sir. She said that the entity was very, very dangerous and could potentially have killed my sister. "Now that is a ghost story, Cole, of note," said Mr. Anderson, looking rather impressed. "Did you manage to eliminate the spirit from your home, may I ask you?" "Oh, yes, sir, we did. The heaviness in our house lifted, and everybody felt it immediately, sir. It was incredible. Needless to say, my sister never went back to that Pacific graveyard, but she still visits other graveyards, which my mother's not best pleased about. And who can blame her? Reflected Mr. Anderson. Thank you for that very interesting story, Cole. I think we all enjoyed it, said Mr. Anderson. But now it's beddy byes. Everybody groaned. Can't we stay up a little longer, Mr. Anderson? Absolutely not, he chided. We have another exciting day ahead of us in the morning. I want you to team up with your partners again and look for something in nature of interest to you that we can discuss, and it can be anything from a rock to a flower. In the twinkling of an eye, we were all sinking into our sleeping bags, and our minds were drifting off to the world of dreams. And the next morning we awoke to the smell of bacon and eggs filling our campsite. Mr. Anderson had prepared us a sumptuous feast, and was cooking for 20 hungry boys, which is no mean feat, let me assure you. But as usual, he excelled himself. We piled our plates with lots of bacon and scrambled eggs, beans and mushrooms, which we washed down with fresh orange juice. Now off with you, said Mr. Anderson, handing us each bottles of water. Do not wander off too far from the camp, and bring back something very interesting, will you? There's a lot out there, so no excuses. Matty and I decided to walk to the further edge of the prairie, while the other kids were taking walking trails up the higher elevations. I could tell that the prairie stretched back quite a way, and I liked the open space. The wild flowers and the pretty butterflies darting from one flower to another really intrigued me, so I decided that this was the way we should go. Let's go this way, I urged Matty. Should we not have taken the hiking trail, said Matt, like the others? What are we going to actually find on a prairie? Lots, I should imagine, I said. What exactly are we looking for, asked Matt. Anything we find remotely interesting from nature, like a flower or a pine cone. Anything that intrigues us in some way. It can't be that hard, surely. Matty and I began scanning our surroundings as we meandered through the long grass. All of a sudden I tripped over a rock that was lying submerged beneath the undergrowth, and I let out an agonizing cry as I went flying along the grass and falling on my side, where I could tell that I'd seriously broken or sprained my ankle. I tried to get up, but the pain was excruciating, and I could feel that my ankle was throbbing and pounding, and even when I got up I could barely walk. What the heck did you do? Asked Mac, looking rather vexed. I tripped, I told him. The grass was so long I failed to see the rock jutting up in the ground. Not to worry, he reassured me kindly, lifting up my right arm and guiding me gently with one hand, where I hobbled towards an old tree trunk. You sit over there, he said. I'll go and find Mr. Anderson, but I might be quite a while, so hang in there tight. He might have gone up the trail with the others. I nodded as I watched my friend retreating from whence we'd come and resigned myself for a bit of a long wait, but I sat back to enjoy the perfect view and watch the pretty prairie butterflies darting from one delicate spring flower to the next. It was an exquisitely beautiful day, and I could hear the sounds of tweets and warbles across the valley. The soft shafts of sunlight lit up the areas of the prairie in a gentle, resplendent light, and there was a soft breeze blowing that caused the prairie flowers to sway to the right like tiny dancers. Suddenly everything became very quiet for a moment, as if a moment in time had been but frozen like a picture on your television set that you pause for a moment. In the twinkling of an eye I detected this very weird, rather peculiar smell, and the only way I can describe it to you is that someone had not had a bath for a considerably long period of time and was rather sweaty and niffy. I then heard the sound of heavy feet moving across the prairie, and then I saw him. I had no idea what he was, but I knew at once that this was no bear. As I sat on the edge of the prairie, under a tree, I was nonplussed and bedazzled by what I was observing. So much so, in fact, that for a moment I never even considered my own vulnerability, or the very possibility that I could be in very grave danger. If I was seen by this apex predator, I was in no doubt that I would be. My fear was suspended by total intrigue and fascination as I contemplated what on earth this extraordinary creature actually was. Could I have just observed an unidentified species not yet discovered by science, I wondered? Even if indeed this was the case, I highly doubted that anyone would ever believe such a seemingly incongruous, erroneous story as witnessing this peculiar critter in our reality seemed preposterous enough. The colossal, Herculean-sized creature engendered the primate qualities of the great ape, but also the humanoid influences of a man, and both those characteristics were clearly ingrained in its biological makeup. It was covered in long flowing dark hair, with overlong arms and very powerful legs, with a ripped muscular V-shaped torso, with gargantuan-sized shoulders that merged into a streamlined waist. The head was rather like a dome that sat directly on top of his shoulders like a boiled egg in an egg cup, for I did not behold any visible neck. The critter was easily 7 foot tall, 500 to 600 pounds, and 3 foot wide, and was lofty, powerful, strong, majestic, and exceedingly graceful. In total horror and disbelief, I beheld this awesome beast gliding towards me, swinging his arms backwards and forwards, as though he was marching, and he moved so seamlessly and flawlessly, with large 5-foot strides. In that second I became so fearful, and my heart began to pound violently in my chest, and my breathing intensified rapidly. How could I escape this creature? I could barely move myself, and my ankle was aching. It was too late, because he was now standing only yards away from me, and judging by his bewildered, befuddled expression, he was as surprised to see me, as indeed I was to see him. He stopped still for a moment and just gawked at me through his dark treacle eyes that seemed curious and inquisitive. It was almost as if he was perturbed as to why I was sitting on my own in this vast prairie. He looked at me as if he was scanning my very soul. I felt as if he could read my thoughts and my mind, and that was very unsettling and discomposing. "Please don't hurt me," I kept begging in my heart. "Please, please, please don't hurt me." I just sat there under the tree, eyeballing this creature, and it felt like time stood still, as if the clock of our world had decided to keep the hand on one point for a little longer. The moments that unfolded before me were so surreal, as the creature just locked his gaze with mine, and I struggled to look away. It was that intense. To my amazement, the creature then turned away and began to move past me, gliding through the wooded area where he moved through the trees with such a flawless grace. How can something that size, that balances on 2 legs, move his body with the ease of a ballerina and the dexterity of a gymnast? It defied rational explanation. I knew where he was, as he was climbing up the mountainous ravine, because every time he moved, the trees would sway with his body. I breathed a huge sigh of relief when he was gone from my sight. Oh my God, what did I just see? On reflection, now that I look back all these years later, this critter didn't actually display any form of aggression towards me. To cut a long story short, I was evacuated to hospital, where it was ascertained that I'd only just sprained my ankle, but the doctor assured me that sprains can sometimes feel more painful than breaks. I did tell my best friend Matt what I'd seen, but I could tell by the expression on his face that he thought I'd really seen something else like a bear, and he didn't really believe me. All these years later, I know what I saw, and it was a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Jimmy, but people tend to call me Jim for short, and I'm from Zionsville, which is often referred to as a town within the park. It's located northwest of Indianapolis. It's a really special, intriguing part of the world, still retaining the quintessential quiet tranquility and charming quaintness of a small town. Yet at the very same time, it is situated conveniently close to a large, bustling, vibrant metropolis of thriving shops, restaurants and businesses alike. We have over 17 parks and 400 acres of parkland here, so for the outdoor enthusiast and ardent adventurers like myself, Zionsville most certainly ticks all the boxes. I live here in a green, leafy, older neighbourhood where so many of the eclectic houses are completely unique, and our house is no exception to that rule. In more recent years, there's been a great deal of development, with new sizable neighbourhoods being created, born out of new money, where the houses look uncannily the same and lack that charm, character, personality, individuality and mysterious intrigue of the older sector homes. My family initially moved to Zionsville from Chicago when I was about 8 years old, so I have no real memory of my early life there. But my dad was transferred here by his company that was branching out in Indianapolis, and my father fancied a change of scene, and the family has never regretted the move, even for a moment, because we love it here. I grew up with my older sister Rachel and my younger brother Oliver, and I can honestly say that we had a great childhood, as even today Zionsville has got to be one of the safest places to live and has some of the most amazing schools in the area. As a result, my parents never bothered about us as kids, riding our bicycles in the neighbourhood here and playing with the other children. We lived in a very simple, charming-looking 50s home that had undergone numerous alterations over the years, where modern influences had been added to the house without destroying that quintessential old-world charm. Our house had a standard front and backyard, and although pretty simple, the seamless symmetrical lines made the house aesthetically rather pleasing to the eyes. Growing up in Zionsville, I had two best friends that lived in our street, a few doors down from my own home. One was a boy called Ivan, and the other was Ted. As kids, given we were similar in age, the three of us became like brothers. I hung around with them more than my own siblings, as we attended the same schools together, were in the same year, and lived on the same street. We even called our friendship the Three Musketeers, and we would have sleepovers at each other's houses regularly. It would seem that Ted lived in a very old Victorian home, and although I never admitted it to him, I never liked staying over at his house, because it had a strange, sinister, airy feeling about it, which I sensed as a young boy. It would always feel as if the house was almost staring at you with sinister-looking eyes, and it would give me the creeps. I did, of course, confide in Ivan how I felt about Ted's house, and it would seem I wasn't alone in my misgivings about it. "There's something super weird about that house," Ivan admitted to me. "It always feels as if someone is watching you, someone really menacing and horrible." One night when I was staying at the Victorian house for a sleepover, we were all sleeping on the living room floor in our sleeping bags by the fireplace, as earlier in the evening we'd been watching television together and had ordered pizzas. I had awoken to find Ivan's shoe being thrown at my sleeping bag. I woke up with a start, looking around the room cautiously. Someone had thrown the shoe at me, but it wasn't Ivan, nor was it Ted, as they were both fast asleep. So who on earth was it? I began to shiver violently because this freezing air just entered the room. I can't describe it to you. It was weird. It felt as if I was sitting in a refrigerator. I've never known cold air to sweep into a room before like that. I began to shiver with the cold, which was odd because it wasn't cold in the house, nor outside. I glanced around the room again, and another one of Ivan's shoes went flying up into the air on its own accord, hitting me on the side of the head. I was nonplussed, as it would seem that the shoe had been thrown at me with deliberate, malevolent intent, but there was no one there. I immediately shook Ivan awake. "Wake up, wake up," I told him. I then told him everything that had happened. Suddenly we both saw the silhouette of a dark woman standing there, and she looked so real, and for a moment we were able to see her quite clearly, as the outside light seemed to cast its shadows upon her ghostly form. I believe she fully intended for us to see us. I think she wanted to terrify the life out of us. For a second I could hardly believe what we were seeing. The woman was short, rounded around the middle, with crepey white skin and grey curly hair. She was wearing dark clothes and a black veil over her head. But the hostile, malevolent way she was glaring at us sent chills down my spine. We both screamed so loudly that Ted's mother came racing down the stairs and asking us what on earth was the matter. We both told her that we'd seen a ghost, and she assured us adamantly that we must have both just had a very bad dream. But there were two of us that had had this dream, if that were the case. Ivan began scribbling away at his drawing pad, and he was a remarkable artist. He recreated a perfect picture of the woman that we had just witnessed. "That's what we saw," he said to Ted's mother, presenting her with a picture of the old lady. When Ted's mother saw the picture, her face went deathly white, and the colour drained from her face. Her eyes grew as wide as saucers, and she began to shake. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, and we both nodded. "That was my grandmother," said Ted's mother, looking bewildered. "This was her home once, but she was a vindictive, spiteful, nasty, cantankerous woman who used to beat my grandfather black and blue with the back of her frying pan. Of course, in those days, men could hardly admit to being beaten up by their own wives. It would have been nonsensical to most. My grandfather really tired of her relentless abuse. It never stopped for a day in and day out. It was continuous. If she didn't like you, believe me, you knew about it, because she would throw things at you to drive you away. And so my poor mother never brought friends back to the house for that very reason. When she died, my grandfather was actually heartily relieved. He couldn't abide the acrimonious woman. The thought of that implacable witch in my house just gives me the chills. When she was dying, she told my grandfather that she'd come back to haunt him. Now, based on what you're telling me, that may well have happened. Poor Grandpa. He got rid of her in life, and she possibly came after him in death. Oh, it just horrifies me to just think about it. Needless to say, Ivan and I told Ted very clearly that we would never sleep over at his place again because of that ghastly ghost that we had seen, who clearly didn't want us there. We were assured by his mother that she had smudged the place with sage to drive the evil away, but we were not convinced that that lingering spirit of that horrifying woman would ever leave that home, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if she's still there throwing shoes at anyone she's aggrieved with to this very day. The story I'm about to share with you happened to the three of us when we were about 22 years old and had all become keen hunters. I would not go so far as to say that we were good by any manner of means, but I will say that we were developing, sharpening and refining our skills. But learning to hunt with savvy adroitness and artful proficiency is a progressive, systematic process that takes time. And so as beginners, we all had a great deal to learn, but we were enthusiastic and passionate, which was a very good start. However, in terms of personality, we were all exceedingly different. Ted, I believe, was the worst hunter out of the three of us, as he was so hot-headed, impatient and impulsive. Sometimes on a hunt, he'd failed to engage his brain before he took a shot, which often meant that the deer was startled and ran off, alerting the rest of the herd to our presence, which meant that the hunt was pretty much over for all of us. Ivan, on the other hand, is a very meticulous and fastidious kind of person, sometimes painfully so, and there are times he's been so intent on getting that perfect shot that in his ardent pursuit of perfection he sometimes missed the mark. He's just so particular, and by the time he wants to aim at the deer, it's invariably scuttled away. Then there's me, of course, and I'm by no means a perfectionist like Ivan, nor am I impulsive like Ted, but I am patient and I do tend to think before I act, which does have huge advantages for any aspiring hunter. It would seem that the three of us had found the perfect place to seasonally hunt whitetail, which was at a private hunting lodge that was in a very attractive part of the world, close to Harrison Crawford State Forest. And we all possessed 222 Remingtons and had ensured that we had bathed with scentless soaps and followed all the stringent protocols in ensuring that our hunting clothes smelt like the natural terrain rather than our own body odour. We even placed our camouflage regalia in Ziploc bags with some earth and leaves from the environment, and had left them in that state for a few days to so much as marinade, I suppose. We arrived at the hunting lodge in the early hours of the morning, before the sun had risen over the horizon. I do remember it was a crisp, cold day, with blasts of cold air punnelling against our faces, and the wind in the trees blowing the rustling leaves off the ground, creating a lovely whistling sound. We walked over the crunchy golden leaves in the wooded area, trying to keep a low profile and ensuring that we were doing our level best not to be detected, as the last thing we wanted was our cover blown. 5 days prior we had scouted the property in search for deer scat and ascertained the best locations to find a good white-tail buck with a sizable-looking rack. We set up our deer blind in between some trees only yards away from a large pond. We did this so that the animals would become accustomed to it, if indeed they noticed it at all. We had also laid down a generous large trail of grapes and apples for 5 consecutive days, which appeared to be working a treat, as the sweet smell of the fruit had surreptitiously drawn the deer to our prime location. We had even spread fruit around rather randomly over here and there to a greater area that led towards our stand. We did not want the deers to see through our crafty ruse. I personally believe that you can never underestimate the intelligence of these creatures, and I think they're far more savvy than we give them credit for, and we call that the art of survival that is intrinsically built within every living animal. As my father always told me, pretend to be a deer for a moment. What's going to make you suspicious to your environment and alert you to the fact that you are being hunted? In my opinion, the slightest thing out of place or an unfamiliar smell is definitely going to get your hackles up, and rightly so. I was feeling excited on this lovely morning, as indeed we all were. I could even envisage in my mind's eye that we would certainly be taking down a whitetail this morning, as the signs were all looking positive and very promising. Sometimes we've used some of the tools of the trade, such as female scents, to lure a large male to our stand, but on this occasion we were having none of that. On a previous time the scent had failed to work at all for us, and had actually backfired on us. It was almost as if the male deer we were stalking had seen through our cunning plot, and had not bitten the bait, Or maybe the smell hadn't been that convincing. One way or the other, it hadn't worked. Before long, we were all seated behind our blinds, keeping very, very still. And even if I say so myself, we were inconspicuous and well camouflaged. All of a sudden, we were alerted to someone whistling, and I could see that Ted had grown crimson. He looked heartily annoyed. "No one is supposed to be here this morning," he said, looking aggrieved. "We were assured by the lodge that we had the place to ourselves this morning. Now this dude, whoever he is going to ruin the hunt for us. I should give him a piece of my mind." "He shouldn't be here," I agreed. "I don't understand what's going on." The whistling continued, and Ted was growing increasingly angry. By this time the sun was rising over the escarpment, and the sky was bathed in the glorious haze of golden yellow hues, with its pretty shafts of sunlight casting gentle spotlights on the tree limbs and the golden leaves that carpeted the ground in thick layers. It would seem almost as if a dimmer switch was being gently turned up ever so slowly, and gently as the dusky night faded away, much like the raindrops on a windscreen being wiped off the glass. It was that quick. In a trice, the soft blue firmament came into focus, and a new morning with a cool breeze was actually birthed. The whistling continued, getting louder and louder, and we could hear heavy feet crunching the leaves, and whoever was walking towards us was without doubt a man of sizable girth. But we had no shortage of big men in Indianapolis, so I was not that perturbed about that. On the contrary, I was so peeved off at the sheer audacity of this individual, whoever they were. They were likely to have alerted the deers to our human presence. After all our exemplary bodacious efforts to remain invisible, this individual could potentially have spoiled absolutely everything for us, and unequivocally ruined our morning hunt, which was a monumental setback. "Selfish sod," snapped Ted. "Oh, there he is." We could see the hazy blur and outline of the brawly humanoid moving in the shadows against the light towards our deer stand. I could tell that he was a very stocky, tall, well-built man. "I'm going after him now," said Ted. "No, Ted," said Ivan. "Let me speak to the man. You might get his back up. I'll speak to him very nicely. You always wind people up the wrong way and bring on a fight, and that's the last thing we need." "I suppose you're right," admitted Ted. "It's hard for me to contain my anger at times." "Excuse me," I could hear Ivan calling. Excuse me, what are you doing here? This is private land." "Good," I thought to myself happily. "Ivan will sort that man out." I focused my binoculars on the scene unfolding before my eyes, and I nearly had a heart attack. Ivan was now standing yards away from the whistling man, but this was no man. What on earth was it? Then reality hit me as hard as a dagger in the back. "Oh my God," I thought. "It's a Bigfoot. No, that's not possible. No, it can't be right." I could not believe what I was actually seeing. I discerned through my binoculars that Ivan was shaking in terror. I could see his whole body wobbling violently like a blancmange jelly. I'd never seen him so afraid before. He was absolutely terrified. Why was he just standing there and not running away? It looked like he was frozen to the spot like an ice statue. I'd actually heard of fear like that before, and I was observing it for myself firsthand. "It's a Bigfoot," I said to Ted. "It's a Bigfoot." Ted was looking through the binoculars, and I could see him say, "Oh my God, it's huge! It's absolutely colossal! I've never seen anything like it before! Oh my God!" He was right, of course. The creature was Herculean in size. I could discern it was at least 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and 3 foot wide, and it was covered in long, flowing dark hair, and was quite terrifying to observe. I realised at once that the critter actually had breasts because they moved when she walked. Suddenly Ted began firing some arbitrary shots, although I do not believe he intended them to be so random, chaotic, or capricious, as he was trying to aim his rifle at the critter and failing abysmally in his efforts. He was shaking so violently with anxiety that he failed to keep his rifle straight, and made things 1,000 times worse. It was clearly apparent he was intending to kill the Bigfoot. As usual, he'd not engaged his brain for a moment, as the critter's strength was equivalent to at least 6 men, and we were outnumbered. There was only 3 of us. There was no prizes for guessing who would win this battle. "What the hell are you doing, Ted?" I screamed. "You're a blithering idiot. Stop now, or we're both dead." You're making things 1,000 times worse. The bull-headed Ted recklessly failed to listen to my sound advice and continued to fire his stray shots, missing his target every time. The critter was so agile and dexterous that it was faster than the bullets and effortlessly seemed to dodge them all. Ted's precarious shooting was not causing the Bigfoot to flee. On the contrary, it was running directly towards us like a thundering herd of bison and charging us like a rhino that was intending to kill. I could tell by Ted's mortified expression that he realized how powerless and helpless he had become, and I'm certain his life was flashing before him in those final moments. I can only imagine the terror that he must have been feeling, because the Bigfoot wasn't packing any punches and was singling him out like a bull at a bullfight, gunning for the red flag, and I was pretty certain that Ted was already dead. I promise you, Ted was so terrified that his rifle slid out of his hands and fell to the ground. Before I knew it, this critter grabbed Ted in his overlong arms and hurled him in the air, throwing him towards the pond, where I could hear his body crashing into the water with a mighty splash. She then grabbed his rifle from him and threw it into the pond. The Bigfoot turned and looked at me directly. Her eyes studied me curiously. I immediately put my gun on the ground, and she visibly relaxed. But she also picked up my rifle and threw it also into the water to ensure that I wasn't going to use it on her. This critter was without doubt the scariest thing that I've ever observed in my entire life. But shooting at her had been a very grave mistake indeed. She was powerful, lofty and majestic, and with one blow from her hand, you could be lifting up the daisies without a doubt. The Bigfoot looked at me very directly, and then she chattered in a strange tongue, as if she was speaking to me. I really sensed she was saying, "Why all this violence? Can we not live together in peace? We're more alike than you actually know." I know it sounds really out of worldly and bizarre, but those words were audibly articulated in my head, almost as if they were verbal. I observed that this hairy humanoid had deep treacle brown eyes, which regarded me intently, almost as if she was reading my mind. I sensed that she was not aggressive, but peace-loving by nature, a creature who loathed and despised altercations and discord of any kind. She found them to be of life's petty nuisances. Perhaps she'd experienced enough dysfunctional behaviour among her own kind before, and just couldn't abide it. I detected a kindness in her that was hard to explain. My encounter with her could have been so different if Ted had not been so dreadfully impulsive and overreactive in the way that he had been. "I'm so sorry," I said, pointing towards the pond, and then to my head as I tried to communicate that Ted was not of sound mind when he shot at her. I sensed that she understood what I was saying and accepted my apology, as strange and erroneous and outer-worldly as that sounds, but I promise you, you'd have had to have been there to see it. I watched her awestruck and mesmerised as she began to glide away so seamlessly. Impulsively I ran after her with a plastic bag full of snacks in my hand. "Excuse me," I called. The critter turned around to look at me. Her eyes glanced at the plastic bag that I was holding, which I handed to her. I watched her rifling through the goodies. There was peanuts, cookies, chips, fruit, chocolate and a bacon quiche in the bag, and I could sense that she seemed rather pleased. It was my way of apologising for our abysmal, appalling behaviour. After she had disappeared from our sight, I went over to Ivan, who was just standing there in a pool of sweat, shaking violently. "Has he gone?" she cried. "It was the most dreadful creature I've ever seen. I thought I was already dead." "Well, she walked past you, didn't she?" I said. "If she'd wanted to kill you, then you'd have been a goner already." "Why did Ted have to shoot at her like that?" he said, shaking. "It was the most stupid thing he could have done. That critter is much stronger than the three of us together. And as for using a rifle on her, she kept moving her body out of the way, faster than lightning." Suddenly I saw the bedraggled, pathetic form of Ted walking towards us. He looked incredibly sorry for himself. His body was sopping wet, and his drenched clothes clung to his body tightly. "Did you see what that hairy monster did to me?" he snapped. "I could have been killed back there. It was difficult to take her down. It was like she dodged every one of my bullets. I mean, how can anything move that fast?" "You got off lightly," I told him. "If it had been a male Bigfoot, I don't think you'd be talking to me right now. You're lucky she threw you in the pond like that, and not against a tree or something. I told you and I warned you not to fire, but would you listen? No, you wouldn't.
I do believe she had no intention of harming us, but you were like a bull in a china shop and you went for her. Oh, I'm so mad at you." Needless to say, both Ivan and Ted had a very different impression of the Bigfoot than I did. They based all their perceptions on her very intimidating, powerful appearance, which, granted, is incredibly scary. To this day, Ted thinks Bigfoot should be wiped off the face of the earth, based on his personal experience with being thrown into that pond, while Ivan breaks out in a cold sweat whenever he recalls his encounter with the Bigfoot and believes it was the most terrifying thing that he'd ever encountered. But when I reflect on the Bigfoot encounter, my impression is completely different, like night and day from my friends. I recall her kind, intelligent eyes, and when I remember them, only warm thoughts spring into my mind, because I believe the female Bigfoot I encountered was misunderstood by my friends based on their alarmed reactions to her appearance, which I quite understand, but in my experience the critter I encountered really did have a heart of gold, and I shan't forget her in a hurry. After our encounter that day, we all did go home, and it would seem that hunting for deer lost its appeal to Ivan and Ted, and so as far as I know, 2 of our rifles are still lying at the bottom of that pond. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Douglas, but most people call me Doug for short. I'm from New York City and live in a very charming historic neighborhood known as Brooklyn Heights, with its brownstone apartment buildings. Most of these apartments were built prior to the Civil War. This has been a prominent section of Brooklyn since 1934 and embodies the most amazing views over Brooklyn Bridge and the exquisite Manhattan skyline. I promise you, at sunset, when the orange gold sun melts across the sky in resplendent folds of rich tangerine hues, it truly is a magical sight to behold that can quite literally take your breath away. I fell in love with this enchanting neighbourhood at first sight, as it has a very small town feel about it, with leafy green streets that are laced with tall shaded trees, and houses rich in impressive grandiose architectural styles. Our stylish neighbourhood has been home to much beloved people from the past, like the likes of Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller. When you walk down our streets, you definitely feel as if you're stepping back in time to another decade in history. Our attractive apartment is conveniently located in close proximity to interesting shops, old-world cafes, quirky boutiques, and excellent restaurants, and so we can literally walk everywhere we like. I live in one of those brownstone apartments myself with my family, which is actually a brick house with a stone facing. The brownstone is actually a Jurassic sandstone, which was at one time a popular building material that used to come from the quarries, and can literally vary in colour from quarry to quarry, from pinks to oranges and purples, depending on the minerals in the Pacific clay. Our imposing apartment block is built in the quintessential federal style, which bears a striking resemblance to Georgian architecture, only it's much more delicate and slender. I would describe our spacious apartment as rather like a classical square box that's about 3 stories high, with double-hung arched windows, a side-gabled roof featuring swags, garlands and urns, with geometrical concepts such as elliptical and fan-shaped motifs formed by fluted radiating lines. I live in one of those apartment blocks as a young boy growing up with my parents as well. When I got married to my wife Brenda, we both moved into another apartment block further along the street so that we could raise our children in close proximity to their doting grandparents, who were desirous to be actively involved in their grandchildren's lives, as we've always been an exceptionally close family. My strange, rather peculiar story that is unequivocally linked to my Bigfoot encounter all happened after a seemingly innocent visit to my doctor's office. I decided to visit him because I noticed that I was regularly coughing up phlegm with blood in it, and I just thought as a precautionary measure that I would have it checked out, and so I engaged in a series of standard blood tests. Imagine my horror when the doctor actually affirmed to me that I had cystic fibrosis. I had no words to express the gravity of the distress one feels when given such horrifying news. It really takes a considerable amount of time to process such a thing. I was dumbstruck by the diagnosis, but my first immediate concerns were naturally to my 2 daughters, Stephanie, who was 8 years old, and Carla, who was 10 at the time. I asked the doctor whether there was any possibility that either of my 2 children could have inherited the disease from me genetically. I will never forget the nonplussed expression on my doctor's face. I noticed that he immediately avoided eye contact with me, and shifted uncomfortably and awkwardly in his seat. And then he finally said it, but I could tell that he didn't want to. "You are infertile, Mr. Matthews. It would have been impossible for you to fertilize your wife's eggs." "Are you sure about this?" I asked, looking bewildered. "Could there not have been a mix-up with the blood tests? Maybe I don't have cystic fibrosis after all. Could you have possibly made a mistake?" "We would not be very professional, Mr. Matthews, if we made mistakes like that. You definitely have cystic fibrosis. The tests make it very clear." "You mean my kids are not actually my children biologically?" I asked, hardly daring to believe this horrifying revelation. "It would seem so, Mr. Matthews," he said. "Perhaps you should speak about this with your wife." I walked away from that doctor's appointment, my mind in a complete whirl. This could not be happening to me. In one moment my life had been blown apart like an atomic bomb that was blowing up in my face. For a moment I felt so numb that I was unable to feel anything at all. Surely there was some mistake, I thought. I drove straight to my mother's home. She lived in a brownstone apartment block as well, and she ushered me into the living room. "What on earth is wrong, sweetheart?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Are you all right?" I sat on her chair, looking just like a clockwork robot, and proceeded to tell her about my diagnosis at the doctor's. "You have cystic fibrosis," she said, aghast, repeating the words with a look of great trepidation on her face. "Oh, darling, I'm so sorry," she said, taking me into her arms to reassure me. "Mum," I told her, "it's worse than you could ever imagine." I proceeded to confide in her that I was unlikely to be the real father of both of my children. "Do you realise what this means, Mother? It means that Brenda has been cheating on me, and my own children aren't my own." "Of course they're your own, sweetheart," my mother corrected me. "It takes more than biological blood to be a father, and you're an awesome father to those kids of yours, and no one can ever take that away from you. You hear me?" "How do I confront Brenda about this?" I asked my mother. "I can't just accuse her of cheating on me, can I?" "You don't do anything, dear, until you're absolutely sure. You need to get a DNA test from your kids surreptitiously, of course, to find out what on earth is going on. But even if the tests affirm your worst fears or darkest nightmares, you really need to tread very, very carefully, because you stand to lose way too much. So this is going to take time. Mum, I feel so dead inside. I feel as if my whole life has been a lie." "Sweetheart, that's absolutely not true. Even if your wife did have an affair, and even if your children are not your own, they all love the bones off you. You know that's true. You love them as much as if they were your own, and in their eyes, you are their father." I was glad to have visited my mother and felt so much better about everything. But when I returned home, I did feel very discomposed and unsettled, and for an entire week I felt nauseous the whole time, and was unable to eat a thing, as such was the level of my distressed affliction. I would look at my children with so much love, and the thought that they might not be my own was utterly heartbreaking for me. As for my wife, even contemplating that she had cheated on me during our marriage was gut-wrenching, gloomy and disconsolate. Was I such an uninspiring, prosaic husband that she had sought the company of another man? My wife was my very best friend, and her betrayal was utterly soul-destroying. When I did receive the DNA results, I opened them in the presence of my mother at her apartment block. I needed a great deal of courage to open those papers, and my heart was fluttering in my chest as my fingers wobbled precariously as I finally tore open the papers. "Go on," she urged. "You can do it." My hands began to shake and wobble, and I opened up the results, and my worst fears were confirmed. My children were indeed not my own. That was the worst, most horrifying news. "What are you going to do, dear?" asked my mother. "I do warn you, you must think before you act, and whatever you do, don't be too hasty about anything. You have the lives of your grandchildren to consider, and those children are very precious, and they deserve their father. But I need to confront Brenda," I told her. "I need to get to the bottom of this. I need to find out exactly what's going on." "As I said, don't do anything too hasty, sweetheart. Don't do anything that you might regret. Suddenly I was feeling a growing sense of indignation, as now that my suppressed anger had been unleashed like a dog from a chain, I became incandescent with rage. I wanted to throttle Brenda. How dare she cheat on me like this, I thought, feeling irate. I actually wanted to explode or hit something violently hard. I wanted to kill her. I ran back to the apartment, ready to unleash my wrathful acrimony on my wife. But very fortunately for her, she was out shopping with the kids. Like a bull in a china shop, I rampaged around the apartment and began to throw all the china around the house, breaking all the items of value that I could find, including some luxurious designer vases that Brenda really loved. I didn't care about anything. I broke everything that I could get my hands on, until our house resembled a Greek family wedding. I want to assure you that such an exercise is exceedingly satisfying, and I felt a whole lot better letting out my grievances on the crystal and china, and our apartment looked like a bomb had hit it. "What the heck happened here?" asked Brenda when she came back to the apartment, her face growing as white as a sheet. "Oh my goodness! Have we had a break-in or something?" "Something like that," I told her, "but we'll talk about it after dinner." When I told Brenda about my cystic fibrosis and that I was not the father of her children, I was amazed to discover that she had no comprehension that this was indeed the case, and she was genuinely shocked that I was not our children's biological father. "But you cheated on me during our marriage," I protested. "The DNA affirms that very clearly. Are you going to deny what you did? How you've dishonoured and mocked our very marriage?" "I know, sweetheart, I did, but it was only shortly after we got married, when I was a bit flaky and ungrounded with my head in the clouds. I'm not that selfish girl any more, I promise you. Over the years our love became so strong, I could never have done it to you again. I was to learn that my kid's natural father was a man called Danny. I used to date him before we got married," she told me. "We made a pact together when we were young that one day when we got married and went our separate ways, we would meet at the Waldorf Astoria on the 28th of May every year for a single day of passion, and it would be our little secret that our respective spouses need never know about. We were not to keep in touch or communicate, but if we wanted to meet up, then we would need to be at the Waldorf Astoria on that particular date. One day I decided to actually see if Danny had remembered our little pact that we made all those years ago. I was sure he'd have forgotten. I could hardly believe that he was there waiting for me. One thing led to another, and we ended up meeting once a year at the Waldorf Astoria, but it never occurred to me that he would make me pregnant on 2 separate occasions." "Well, it might explain why our kids' birthdays are so close together," I said. "What are you going to do?" asked Brenda, the tears filling her eyes. "You're not going to divorce me, are you? I love you so much, and I'm so sorry for what I did. I never meant to hurt you. Danny never meant anything to me. It was all just a bit of fun. I was just stupid and naive and... I wasn't thinking properly." "That doesn't make it right," I said. "Our kids have another father that they do not know, and Danny has 2 girls he has a right to know about." "Well, he has 7 kids of his own already," my wife informed me. "He's also happily married. I don't know how his wife would react if she was to find out that he had 2 more children from another woman." "Well, he should have thought about that before he started copulating with you, shouldn't he?" Fast forward a week or so, and I informed my wife Brenda that I needed to do some pensive soul-searching and would be going away on my own to make some decisions about our future. I told her that I needed to be in my man cave and to do some introspection, rumination and self-reflection. "I'm not making any promises about anything," I told her, "so don't get your hopes up." I booked a short flight from New York to Alberta in Canada, and I hired a car to a cabin I'd booked for my solo adventure. This was the very first time I'd been away on my own without my family, but I knew I needed the space in a room, along with the peace and quiet, to make some long-term decisions about my life. Growing up, my father had always informed me, "Son, when you need to reflect and ruminate, you need to get to somewhere beautiful and peaceful where you can meditate and deliberate on your own. You can ask God or the universe to guide you to the answers you seek. You'll be amazed, son, how the answers will just flow to you." I was now taking my father's wizened advice, and as I drove down the windy gravel pathway towards the cattle gate that I opened and closed behind me, I kept driving and passed a number of side roads, all leading to different cabins. I'd been informed that my cabin, known as the Beaver's Den, was the most remote cabin of all, as it was the furthest away. "It's the prettiest cabin of all," I was told. "You'll feel as if you're in the middle of nowhere, And your cabin overlooks the lake where you can go fishing, and everything you need is available for you in the cabin, like fishing rods and tackle. You must give me a shopping list of what you'd like me to purchase for you in the way of food, and then you'll have everything you need. So thankfully everything had been organised for my arrival at this quaint, sublime destination. Nothing prepared me for how magnificent this sumptuous abode would actually be. I really began to wish heartily that my family could be joining me on this amazing adventure. The cabin was whimsical, charming, and seemed much more befitting for a fairy tale than our natural reality. The breathtaking views were bewitching and bedazzling, and if you had told me I'd died and gone to heaven, I would most certainly have believed you. I beheld with my own eyes a turquoise lake. It was surrounded by a backdrop of statuesque mountainous views with defined sculptural ridges that rose up into the firmament like masterful giants, and some of its lower ridges were carpeted in what appeared to be a verdant moss, but I knew in reality they were actually alpine trees. The blue lake shimmered in the valley like a sapphire diamond, and its gleaming mirror reflected the rich resplendent views of the alpine trees and mountains. My cabin was situated on an open clearing a few hundred yards from the lake. On its left-hand side was an undulating hill with very clear hiking trails that was densely wooded and stretched back for many miles on a high elevation. On the right-hand side was an open prairie filled with long grasses and pretty spring flowers, with a white wicker fence where a couple of grey speckled horses were grazing. It was adjacent to the path that led to the cabin and the long grey gravel road. As for the cabin, it was built to perfection, clearly by someone with artistic flair, imagination and immense style. It was picture perfect and was made from pine timber beams, with 2 floors, a wraparound porch and balcony, with large windows and sliding doors, making the most of the idyllic panoramic views. I couldn't have asked for anything more enchanting. Imagine the most beautiful wooden cabin you could conceive existing on this planet, and you might get close to how quaint, picturesque and enchanting this cabin was to behold. The interiors did not disappoint either, as they made the most of the open-plan living, which included sumptuous cosy couches, coffee tables covered in interesting books, rich burgundy Persian carpets, and bedrooms filled with double-sledge beds swathed in expensive Egyptian cottons. I was impressed, and a quick trip to the kitchen with its well-stocked fridges affirmed to me that every last detail had been attended and catered for, including bear sprays and air horns. That evening I made a beautiful fire and sat around it watching the flames crackling away in the large fireplace, and it would seem that my eyes were locked in a trance. I hasten to say that my mind emptied itself of any thoughts. I had come here to brainstorm, but I thought of nothing as I drank a beer, ate some pasta, and finally retired to bed, and I fell into a deep sleep, awaking about 3 in the afternoon the following day. I was startled by how late in the day it actually was, and completely flabbergasted that I'd slept in so late. I'd clearly needed the sleep, and actually felt somewhat rejuvenated, restored and refreshed. I was not hungry, so I decided to take a brisk walk through the greenwood, just to get a touch of fresh air and exercise. I knew it would do me the world of good. I began to almost ask God, or the universe if you like, for a clear outlandish sign that I should in fact stay with my family and not divorce my wife. I wasn't expecting to have one, let me tell you, but why not ask anyway? As I ventured up this hilly incline and followed the hiking trail, I could hear the pretty bird song in the valley, and I meditated on how charming everything was, and my spirits lifted considerably as I appreciated the wondrous beauty of such an exquisite day. I marvelled at a couple of love-struck squirrels scurrying up a tree branch, and they both studied me with curious eyes, and a couple of snowshoe hares that darted across my path very quickly, clearly rather skittish to have now seen me. Before long I heard this very strange, peculiar sound that I have no way to describe to you, or to even put it into words, but it sounded like several high-pitched whooping sounds. I had never heard a strange noise like this before, and my curiosity escalated, and I crept ever closer forwards, moving very silently towards the noise. And that was when I saw something that was so odd I thought I must be dreaming. I positioned myself behind a tree to behold this absurd peculiarity. I'd never known bears capable of dancing on 2 legs like a human before, but this is what I was seeing. Now, if anything was off the charts weird, it had to be this, what I was discerning now. It was only a few seconds into my surveillance that I realized that these creatures were indeed not bears. But what on earth were they? I could not even begin to imagine. I was from New York, and the subject of Bigfoot was barely ever discussed, contemplated, or even considered. And when it was, the city folk here certainly didn't believe that the critter was in the least bit real. Well, not the ones that I knew anyway. In fact, the very notion that Bigfoot was real would almost have certainly engendered ridicule among my friends. Yet I knew that these titanic creatures were indeed Bigfoots, because they quite simply could not have been anything else. The tallest was about 10 foot, and the other two were about 7 foot tall, with a width of 3 feet across, and between 600 to 900 pounds in weight. They were covered in long, human-like dark hair that had red highlights in it. It was rather matted and worn away on the knees and the sides of the torso, possibly due to the chafing of arms against the skin. I beheld that the colossal bodies were powerfully built with excessive lean muscle mass and absolutely no fat. I would say that they were like a cross between an ape and a man, because both human and ape-like characteristics were predominant in their profiles. One thing I would like to point out, that nothing could have prepared me for the size of these gargantuan beasts, because they were so powerful, mighty, majestic and strong. The critters had overlong arms and the most massive shoulders that I've ever seen, and the pyramid head literally embraced the shoulders seamlessly in a long, flowing vertical line, with absolutely no evidence of a neck. In my binoculars I could detect the oval, hairless faces that possessed leathery grey skin, with prominent, heavily wrinkled brow ridges, very flat pug-like noses, and deep-set, rusty-coloured eyes. Was I afraid? I certainly should have been. There were 3 of them, and 1 of me. I was vulnerable behind the tree. I knew I was. If they saw me, I could be a goner. I was in no doubt that these creatures were mighty powerful, and certainly apex predators, and they seemed incredibly intimidating. Yet I did not feel fear in that moment, possibly because I was suspended in this alternative reality, almost as if I was watching something on television. Yet I knew I was seeing the scene unfold before my very eyes, and it was indeed very real. I was much more excited rather than afraid, and my heart was fluttering because I knew few people in the world would ever witness what I was observing now, and I knew that I was exceedingly privileged. The 3 Bigfoots were dancing together. Now, who would have ever imagined that that was even possible? They were dancing rather like the May dance that is performed in England on May Day every year to welcome in the first day of spring. It really rather reminded me of that. Even the movements did. They would dance together in a circle and move away, but as they moved into the circle, they would all make a whooping sound at the very same time. It was into the circle and touching hands together with a whoop, and then out of the circle. I was amazed that anything so heavy could dance on 2 legs with such agility and grace. They just knew how to dance. It was like they were floating. I was mesmerized and transfixed. I think even a ballet dancer would have been impressed. I almost got the impression they were celebrating something, and that was when my eyes were drawn to a dead white-tailed deer lying strewn across a tree branch. Could they be celebrating their kill, I wondered? Maybe this was a daily ritual after they'd caught their prey, to celebrate their hunt or something. After what seemed like a short while, the largest animal threw the deer over his shoulder, and they moved away into the woods. But as I was about to turn around to retreat, the female Bigfoot came rushing over to where I was hiding and looked directly at me, and then she walked away. I got the very strong sense that she was saying, "I knew you were there all along." That night when I went to sleep, I had a very vivid, intense dream, and that may not seem out of the ordinary for you, but it was highly unusual for me, as I never dream, or if I do, I have no memory of them. In my dream, the female Bigfoot that I'd seen earlier in the woods was looking at me intensely, and I could see her so clearly as if she was standing only yards away from me. She studied me with her rust-coloured eyes, and she said 4 words that I will never ever forget as long as I live. It was forgive and thrive, or condemn and die. I woke up with a start. I knew that I needed to return home immediately and forgive my wife and move on with my life, because God had given me an outlandish sign when I'd observed the Bigfoots. 20 years later, I'm still so happily married and have completely forgiven my wife, and we are more in love than ever before. I felt it was exceedingly important for my children to meet their real father, and they're delighted to have 7 half-brothers and sisters. In a strange way, I realised that without Danny, I would have never been a father to my 2 precious children, and so in a strange way, I owe him a debt of gratitude. Looking back, without my family, I would have shrivelled and died, so the Bigfoot in my dream was absolutely right. I needed to forgive in order to thrive. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.